afternoon and welcome to our talk entitled Augustana in 1918, One War, One Pandemic. I'm Louanne Beinke and I've been a member of the Augustana Endowment Society for 8 years and treasurer for 3. Nancy?
I'm Nancy Califf. I've been a society member for 15 years. In the society, I have been president, vice president, and recording secretary. I'm currently historian, and I graduated from Augustana with a degree in history.
I did not go to Augustana, but I wish I did. Well, let's get started. At our October meeting, Dr. Wes Brooks, the Dean of Students, spoke of the outstanding student leadership and response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, to combat the virus, the Augustana Strong Task Force has implemented all these precautions we know and love so well, plus others. And if someone does get COVID, they not only quarantine, but they trace contacts as well. It is impressive. Now, our talk covers little about these protocols in 1918, and we will discuss why, but instead we'll look at how the students related to the double whammy of a World War I and the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 and what resulted. Specifically, we'll discuss the following topics in the next 30 minutes or so. What was the Spanish flu epidemic all about? What was campus life like at Augustana? And how did Augustana fare against the epidemic? How did World War I affect Augustana? Why was Augustana affected by the epidemic in the way it was? And finally, what can we learn from Augustana's experience? Now let's start off with a quiz. In terms of the number of cases and deaths, how greatly was Augustana impacted by the Spanish flu epidemic? Was it A, not at all, B, very little, C, about as much as COVID-19 is on campus now, or D, rampantly? Any guesses?
C.
Very good. Actually, this is a tricky question. In terms of today's standards, C would probably be correct. But when you relate to the tougher times of 1918, it would probably be B, very little compared to the US at large. Now, before we discuss the flu, let's look at what was going on in the world in early 1918. On April 6, 1917, Congress declared war on Germany, plunging the US into World War I as part of the Allied forces fighting against the Central Powers headed by Kaiser Wilhelm II. Now, in this authentic colorized picture, note the absence of women and minorities, which is much different from our 2020 election. But 11 months later, a far more deadly foe emerged, one that killed more people than 4 years of fighting, namely the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. So what was this epidemic all about? We're going to ask you. It's commonly said that the COVID-19 pandemic is unprecedented. Now, in terms of the number of cases and deaths in the world and in the US, is this true or false?
That'll be false.
You are correct. The COVID-19 figures so far are not even close to those of the Spanish flu. So let's look at them. Worldwide, an estimated 500 million cases of the Spanish flu occurred, which is about 10.5 times that of the COVID-19 pandemic so far. And deaths, roughly 40 times. In the United States, the Spanish flu had an estimated 25 million cases, 2.7 times that of COVID-19, and 675,000 deaths, 2.9 times that of COVID-19. We hope we don't catch up.
How did the Spanish flu get its name? Well, the Spanish king had come down with it, and since Spain was neutral in World War I, its press was free to report this high-profile case, whereas the nations, in contrast, couldn't for security reasons. The symptoms of the Spanish flu were a lot like those of COVID. It would start like most flu strains with mild headaches, muscular pains, high fever. Then it would progress to vomiting, dizziness, breathing difficulty, and profuse sweating. Then the severe cases would progress to bronchitis and pneumonia and eventually death. The Spanish flu had a much faster onset than COVID, 24 to 48 hours, and it could kill a healthy young person within a day. Where did the Spanish flu start? No one knows, but it was likely to in one of these countries. In the United States, it is believed to have started in Camp Funston, an Army training camp in Fort Riley, Kansas, in March 1918.
How long did the Spanish flu epidemic last? Well, the short answer is about 14 months into May of 1919, but let's look at this graph. We're not sure where this graph came from, but it represents just about anything you want to regarding the Spanish flu, cases or deaths, worldwide or local. It had 3 waves. The first, in March and April of 1918, was just some flu bug the elderly got. A few deaths occurred, but cases dropped off during the summer and the epidemic was declared over. But all the while, those in training were unknowingly taking it from camp to camp, and it started to spread throughout the United States. During the second wave, September through mid-December, it became really widespread. First in Europe because of the mobility of troops and the unsanitary conditions there. Then the US soldiers came home and to the general public unknowingly gave the gift that keeps on giving, namely a mutated, much more deadly strain which likely developed due to wartime poisons. And it spread like wildfire here, killing the young and healthy in 24 hours. Now, the third wave had a much lower death rate due to a less harmful mutation of the germ and herd immunity. It burnt itself out by the spring of 1919, but officially it lasted about 2 years. At first, the federal government was quite cavalier about it, saying it was just commoners. In fact, they made jokes about it, and President Woodrow Wilson never mentioned it in his entire presidency. But as the number of cases exploded, at least scientists went to work on a vaccine. They knew that germs spread disease through the hands and through the air. And in fact, they isolated the germ under a microscope, but the multi-million-dollar efforts to create a vaccine failed. And since antibiotics didn't exist yet, people used home remedies. But eventually, the federal government came up with these familiar guidelines: ventilate and avoid crowds and so on. And above all, don't spit. Now, in the height of the pandemic, in October, the federal government finally urged every city to shut down except for essential businesses and churches and the World Series. But really, the decision of what to close and what to allow open was up to each mayor. And like today, early responses were best. St. Louis quickly shut down and implemented strict precautions and quickly flattened its curve. But Philadelphia refused to cancel its war bond parade. Wear a mask? Nah, epidemic's over. And guess what happened? Oops. Now, San Francisco relied on gauze masks. If you didn't wear your mask in public, you could be fined or sent to jail. But just like today, not everyone wanted to wear them.
So what happened in the Quad Cities? October 4th, 1918, the first Quad City dies of the Spanish flu, and the worst week of it begins. October 8th and 21st, two Quad City public meetings were held to warn everyone of the severity of the epidemic and to urge them to take certain precautions. Ironically, no one wears a mask to either one. October 22nd, flu cases spike. Rock Island closes non-essential businesses, including churches and schools. Late October through early November, as a result of the closure, flu cases subside. November 7th, the war is declared over, yes, 4 days early, and the flu epidemic is declared over as well. The Rock Island shuts down ends. Days later, armistice parades in Davenport and Rock Island draw 20 to 30,000 people. And not surprisingly, mid-November through mid-December, flu cases spike again, only not as bad. After that, they pretty much disappeared around the Quad Cities. How are the sobering figures at the end of 1918? Hope, now how many of those 114 deaths were from Augustana? We'll let you tell us with this final quiz.
Among the active civilian Augustana students, faculty, and staff, how many died of the Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919? Is it A, 15, B, 9, C, 28, or D, 3?
15?
Among the active civilian Augustana students,
Right.
faculty, and staff, how many died of the Spanish flu in 1918
Right.
and 1919?
What was your, right, okay, what was your guesses again? Did somebody guess 15?
I guessed, yeah, 15,
Oh.
is that right?
Nope, only 3, thank goodness. But good try anyway. 1 student and 2 faculty. At least 2 of them died off of campus.
Who were they? First, the faculty. At left is Professor Andrew Kempe, head of the commercial department. On October 16, 1918, he died of the flu during a trip to the Far East. And at right is Professor Albert Ander, head of the violin department. Lovable, but very driven. He tried to be all things to all people, and in doing so, neglected his own health. He died on December 3rd, 1918, at age 35. As for the student, Walter Grants, no photo of him is available, but he was one of a record 133 incoming freshman students in the fall of 1918. He had signed up for Augustana's Student Army Training Corps, but sadly he became ill while home in Michigan for his brother's funeral and died on October 7th, 1918 of the Spanish flu. News of deaths from the Spanish flu and even news of cases of it traveled quickly through Augustana. So if anyone else had died from the flu, everyone would have eventually found out about it through sympathy ads like this in the Observer and other channels. In fact, even if a student's sibling died from the flu, it would often be announced in such ads. So what was this campus like they chose, and how did Augustana fare against the epidemic?
We'll take a look.
Things were hopping at Augustana, as if the flu didn't exist. Students packed 48 hours into a 24-hour day with extracurricular activities such as these. And oh, by the way, they went to class and did their homework. Let's look at some of these activities. There were a lot of literary societies on campus, but these were the main two. They created all these items and they traveled to contests. The Augustana Observer was the monthly newsletter. Before even giving the general campus news, it usually contained 3 or 4 long essays about profound subjects, many pertaining to the war, and of course, there was the yearbook, the Rackety Eye. Oratorical societies. These featured all these activities. They went to Springfield to speak in the Illinois State Fair and went even as far as St. Peter, Minnesota. Other groups just stayed on campus. 3 debate teams. 1 team traveled, 2 did not. Here are the 6 members of the traveling team, which went to nearby colleges for competitions. They always finished first or second, even when many schools were involved. Not surprisingly, for a campus with a seminary, there were many religious and charitable groups, but the main ones were Lutheran Brotherhood for men and Berean Bible Group for women. The men would travel to conferences in Chicago. The Women's Club helped the Red Cross and started the Students' Sick Benefit Fund, which was a type of group insurance with yearly dues of $2, which would be worth about $35 today.
Now, not every endeavor at Augustana was intellectual. They took their intercollegiate sports very seriously. Why? Because watching the, quote, astounding maneuvers of the athletes was fun and distracting. And the games united the schools, and football especially prepared the men for war. Now, the football team wasn't expected to do much, as 2 of last year's key players were in military training, and its season was interrupted by the shutdown, but it finished with a 3-1 record. Likewise, the men's basketball team was missing some players, but still finished 7-3. Not much is known about the women's basketball team or the track and field teams. And to cheer the teams on were the Rooters, the pep club. But what would Augustana be without music? Now, describing all the musical activities would require at least 20 of these slides, but here's a look at those that could have caused the flu epidemic to spread at Augustana. The Wennenberg Choir was a men's touring choir that spread its aerosol all over northern Illinois, Iowa, and Omaha, as did the women's touring choir, the Orioles. Then there were concerts, field trips, single-person recitals, guest artists, and much more. And most of these drew large audiences and often involved outsiders.
Students worked hard, but they also played hard, eating, partying, and laughing. There were banquets for every occasion, from the patriotic to the societies to the 4 classes, and parties and other outings as well, again, from the patriotic to the silly. And every issue of the Observer, plus an entire section of the Rackety Eye, were devoted to humor. There were cartoons, caricatures, and many, many jokes. How about this silly little joke? Freshman, a bill collector is at the door. Junior, good, give him that stack on the table. And they even joked about the flu. How about this little jingle? I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened the window and in flew Enza. But suddenly in late September and early October, as more soldiers returned home carrying the new and more deadly strain of the flu, October would become the deadliest month in the United States, with 195,000 deaths. Just as the city of Rock Island shut down, Augustana was ordered to do so. It started on October 17th and remained so through November 14th, well, sort of. The November issue of the Observer reports, the General News Department has the flu. School has been closed since October 17th, except for the SATC. Everything in the way of social activities, class meetings, debating clubs have been at a standstill. Even the literary societies had an excuse. Some of the dorm girls went home. Others remained to spend the long 2 weeks here. Such a long 2 weeks. But on Saturday, October 25th, those girls entertained the service boys in a taffy pull and eating popcorn. Besides the general news staff getting the flu and having to call in an emergency crew, a few musical concerts had to be postponed, and the football season had to be temporarily halted because of the epidemic. Those and other statements often started with, because of the epidemic, such and such organization had to postpone or cancel such and such event. But other than in the shutdown period, it was hard to tell whether the event was postponed because a person or persons actually had the flu or because Augustana was shut down. So the Spanish flu did strike students and faculty. How many, we'll never know, as all but 3 recovered fully. But when the shutdown was over, campus life resumed as if nothing had ever happened. In fact, some of campus life probably started earlier. In this 230-page yearbook, a fine print section chronicled the events of the school year. It contained these entries. Under October 17th, flu ban at Augie. Nobody but the SATC boys go to school. The 18th, more flu. The 19th, seminary students decide to do something useful, go to work for Housing Corporation. 28th, still more flu. And under November 2nd, Augustana 19, Carson 0. Everybody gets out of bed at 11 bells. Sounds like they were bored out of their minds.
Why was the Rockety Eye the only one that talked about the flu and in a little tiny section of the yearbook? The Observer hardly ever mentioned it at all. We don't know, but students preferred discussing happier subjects, maybe? Maybe they weren't sure that a case was the Spanish flu. The press could have been censored. There weren't that many cases anyway, and probably the most important reason, they were more focused on the war. Which brings us to our next topic. How did World War I affect Augustana?
World War I dominated the attention of Augustana far more than the flu did.
Let's see how.
Augustana, and that's because Augustana contributed much to World War I in various ways. Manpower support, both the active military and the reserves, united support of the above by the entire school, student concern about the New World Order following the war, student eagerness to help war-torn Europe. Let's look at these. First, for manpower support, the active military. By November 1st, 1918, 420 students and recent graduates served in the U.S. Armed Forces, and it came to 434 total from 1917 to 1919. 9 lost their lives, 2 in battle. The count of the wounded is unknown. And then there were the reserves. Before September of 1918, the men had trained for war elsewhere. But on October 1st, the Student Army Training Corps, SATC, started up. This was equivalent of the ROTC today. Since the war was winding down, most of these men were not immediately needed for battle. Nevertheless, weekly they received 53 hours of instruction, and their college expenses were all paid for. Next, on the home front, from the time the United States entered the war, a deep seriousness pervaded Augustana, despite all the fun of campus life. It continued even after the war ended, and it was felt by not only the students, but also by our very own Augustana Endowment Society. Longtime member Lillian Nelson, in her pamphlet entitled Augustana College Endowment Society, wrote the following. No mention was made, presumably of the flu, in the minutes of the Society's 25th anniversary celebration in 1919, probably because of the war. But perhaps the president, presumably Mrs. Margaret Foss, said it best in her 1919 annual report. The year has been for our society what it has been for the whole world, the most depressing in its history. I shall not attempt to enumerate our losses as an organization or as individuals. Let us cherish the pleasant memories of our association together, that we have been able to keep our organization together during these trying times. I rejoice that the war is over, that the victory is won, and hopefully look forward to the dawn of a better day when the nations of the world shall be leagued together in such a way as to successfully prevent future wars. From the time the first cater of Augustana men went to war in April 1917, too long after the war's end, the student body steadfastly supported the military and its reserves with ceremonies, parades, banquets, and entertainment. The Observer printed all letters from the active military. But the imminent victory was not the students' main concern. They knew that the US's entry into the war provided a manpower boost to the Allies, and that a moral victory based on godly human principles would bring about a military victory. But rather, it was the new world order after the war, one of democracy and world peace. Essay after essay in the Observer and elsewhere explored these questions. How do we get there? How do we individually and together help attain these goals such that no more wars would occur? And they knew that the United States must take the lead. The ravaged Allied nations could not. So the students were preoccupied with helping reconstruct Europe. But everyone had a responsibility. Conserve resources, send them abroad were the watchwords, and clean your plate. While several veterans enrolled or returned to campus, very few of the SATC members continued on with their studies. We're not sure why, but many of the war's leaders had come from Augustana. So yes, Augustana truly contributed to the war.
Let's return to the flu epidemic. Why was Augustana so affected in the way they were? Well, actually, in the December issue of the Observer, someone said with fingers crossed, so far the flu has touched us lightly. And that's how it touched them. And it was actually spared of the flu, both in spite of and because of the campus life it chose. Huh? Well, let's look at the in spite of part first. Well, they took chances, albeit innocent. Now, many clubs and societies traveled to compete, exhibit, or perform, often to big cities on crowded, poorly ventilated trains. They met in large groups on campus, such as clubs, banquets, and church services. They attended large concerts, sometimes featuring outsiders. They partied and they cheered loudly for their athletic teams who shared equipment. Now, how about the because of part of this? Granted, they followed local mandates. Well, maybe. Augustana was relatively small, and the campus was shut down for a month. Well, maybe a month. However, there may be just one other reason. Namely, through a positive attitude and a positive environment, they built their own immunity. What are some examples? We'll go down the first column here. They kept busy, no time to worry. They kept connected. They were fatalistic. Back then, a lot of ailments could kill you. With life expectancy being about 52 years, they figured, well, might as well live it up. They were grateful. They were optimistic. And then in the second column, they were reliant, self-reliant. They didn't blame anyone for the two crises. They had a deep religious faith and embraced good-natured humor. They also exercised a lot, just doing chores, and they were unified in their stance on the war. Almost no politics were involved. Now, the League of Nations was another story, but that hadn't been created yet. Now, recent study after recent study is showing that these things minimize stress, which optimize body chemistry, which in turn prevent inflammation, which in turn boosts immunity to a whole lot of diseases. Maybe they were just lucky, but we don't think so. Which brings us to the last part of our talk. What can we learn from Augustana's experience? In particular, with their experience with the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. But before we get to Augustana, let's talk generally. Historians have listed many ways, but they all boil down to these 19 words. First, we're all familiar with the New York Yankee great Yogi Berra's quote, "It ain't over till it's over." In 1918, after each wave, the cases went down because precautions were taken and the authorities declared the epidemic was over. But then people took off their masks, let their guards down, and whoops, along came another wave. Second, and this is directed at all levels of government and the medical profession and the media, tell the truth. In 1918, conflicting information caused people to lose trust in authorities, so they resorted to cures like voodoo and bees. Yum! And things improved only when authorities started telling the truth. Today, there's no excuse for distorting the truth, whether it be for political gain or personal glory, but it's rampant anyway. For example, how about these gems? From our current leader, we've turned the corner on COVID. How we wish. And from a well-known local medical authority here in the Quad Cities, we saw no increase in COVID due to attending protests, but he has implied that you can get it from going to church. So who did the contact tracing? It is up to our new slate of leaders, from the president on down to every mayor, that they must unite with the medical profession and the media to promote the truth about COVID-19 so that facts replace fear. And finally, number 3, drastic interventions work, like they did for St. Louis in 1918. And likewise, the mandates put upon us today seem to work. But it is up to each one of us to make them work. Now, most of us do a great job in obeying these mandates, but something else may make the difference in whether we get COVID or not, and if we do, whether its symptoms are mild or severe. What's that? Well, let's return to the slide we were just on. Read any article nowadays aimed at protecting us from COVID-19, or at the very least lessening its symptoms, and you'll see stuff like what's in this list. Now, all of these are doable for us, except that we are a nation divided, politically and otherwise. We hope that will get better. However, we can control our reaction to it by doing this last red item that we've added here, limiting media exposure. In recent studies of people who have lived to be at least 100 years old, the one and only common characteristic among all of them is positive thinking. And this is the lesson we can take from these Augustana students 102 years ago. In conclusion, though we can learn a lot from its students of 1918, Augustana really hasn't changed that much in 102 years, at least not in what's important. What's important is that Augustana, through teaching organizational and critical thinking skills in a positive environment, continues to equip its students to meet the challenges that life often brings them. And with those skills and attitudes, its students will effectively face whatever future challenges come at them, be they good or bad. We'll open it up to questions and answers, hopefully. Now, one last thing. One society member was born during the deadliest week of the Spanish flu epidemic here locally in early October 1918. At that time, to be admitted to an area hospital, you had to have a temperature of at least 104 degrees. So her birth was relegated to a dirty, rundown sanitarium that was mercifully close to her parents' farm in Barstow, Illinois. All went well. Mother and baby never caught the flu. The mother lived 80 years, and the baby, my mom, Louise Beinke, lived 100 years and 4 months. And in her memory, we dedicate this talk. Thank you very much for attending.